All right, y'all, welcome to our first lesson. To get us started with interpersonal communication, we're first going to talk about interpersonal process. And so if some of you are communication majors, this might be a little bit of review for you, but there's also a lot of new things that you'll probably end up learning in this module as well. So we're going to cover 4 different things in this lesson. First, we're going to talk about why and how we communicate. The second thing we're going to cover are principles and misconceptions of communication. We're also going to discuss impersonal versus interpersonal communication. And then finally, we're going to wrap it up with how to become a more competent communicator. So let's start off by talking about why we communicate. So we have lots of different needs as people. We have physical needs, identity needs, social needs, and practical needs. And communication helps us to meet each one of these. Starting off with physical needs, that's impacted by our communication, as its presence or absence affects our physical health. For example, it helps us improve our mental health. It increases our lifespan by 3.7 years on average. It also lowers the risk of certain diseases like coronary disease, hypertension, obesity, pneumonia, certain types of cancers, surgery, etc. We also have identity needs that are met through communication. So this means that we learn who we are as human beings. Our sense of self, we figure that out in and through communication. We also have different social needs that are met through communication. It's the principal way that relationships are communicated. In fact, it's how relationships evolve. It's how relationships start. It's how they develop. And some scholars even argue that communication is the primary goal of human existence. Goldschmidt in 1990 said that it is the human career to communicate with one another. And then finally, we have practical needs that are met through communication. So things like telling your barber how much to take off the top, or figuring out how to make an appointment with your doctor, or telling them where it hurts. Like, these are all types of things. Our practical needs are met through communicating with other individuals. So you might be wondering at this point, how the heck do we engage in this process of communication and have those needs met? Many years ago, we developed a model of communication called the linear model of communication, which outlines this process. And in this model of communication, let's say that I am the person who wants to get an idea from my head into your head. Now, short of telepathy, I can't just plant it in your head. So we have to engage in this process of communication. So in this model, I am the one with the idea that I want to send to you. So I am the sender. You are the receiver. Now, to do this, I encode a message. I have my idea and I encode it. So I put it in a symbol that I think that you will understand. And then you, as the receiver, will decode these symbols. It's basically doing the opposite process. You're taking those symbols that I gave you and you're interpreting those symbols. So I am encoding a message that you, the receiver, will decode. Now, encoding can happen in multiple ways. We have verbal encoding and we have nonverbal encoding. Verbal encoding is when we are using our words in order to communicate our message. Nonverbal, on the other hand, is anything like posture, gestures, facial expressions. These all help influence how a message is received. So what's interesting about these is that usually people are more likely to believe the nonverbals over the verbals. So if I am delivering a message sarcastically, for instance, you're probably going to rely more on my nonverbal communication as opposed to my verbal communication. So I encode this message and I send it through what's called a channel. And the channel is the medium through which the message is sent. We have lots of different types of channels that we use nowadays. Some of us communicate face-to-face, in which the channel would be the air. Others of us might choose to communicate via video, like I'm doing here right now. Some folks communicate via text message, email, social media. There are all different types of ways that we can, or lots of different channels that we can use. And depending on the channel that we use, we might be able to use more nonverbal, more verbal, or vice versa. So it kind of just depends on that channel. And that has huge implications for how a message is received and interpreted. Now, when we are engaging in this communication process, we also have to compete with noise. Noise is anything that interferes with our ability to receive a message. And we have different types. We have internal noise and we have external noise. And your book even breaks it down a little bit further. So internal noise, you can have physiological noise, or you can have psychological noise. So physiological noise would be anything, let's say, that is going on internally in your body that might interfere with your ability to receive the message. So let's say maybe you have an ear infection or maybe you're hard of hearing. Those would be examples of physiological noise. But we also have psychological noise. That would be anything mentally that's going on that would be interfering with your ability to receive my message. So maybe you're daydreaming about something that's going on or that you want to happen. Maybe you are thinking about your plans for the weekend, or maybe you're hungry and you're thinking about what you want to have for lunch today. Those are all different examples of psychological noise. And then finally, we have external noise. So that is anything out in the environment that might interfere with your ability to receive my message. So let's say there's a glitch going on with the channel, the video, that interferes with your ability to process this. Or maybe I've got gardeners outside. Sometimes that happens outside my window, and that would interfere with your ability to receive my message because it's just so loud, literal noise. Over time, we've adapted this model to add some additional elements to it. So it's not just a one-way kind of process like we have outlined here. Over time, we realized that the receiver also engages in sending messages back via feedback. So when we have feedback, these are anything like a nod or shaking a head, cocking your head to the side indicates that you might be confused about something, or maybe you're asking questions or paraphrasing. These would be all different types of feedback. One thing to note here is that our goal of this entire process is to create shared meaning. As this model of communication has evolved, we've added more things into it, like environment or context. So each person in this model has their own knowledge and experiences that they bring into a communicative interaction, which influences how meaning is interpreted in a message. So I have a different wealth of knowledge and experience than you do, and vice versa. So we have to be able to understand that those might influence the meaning in these interactions. And then finally, one of the things that we've adapted in this model is that it's no longer I send something to you, you send something back to me, this back and forth kind of volleying. Now, we have recognized that both people in an interaction are simply communicators. And what this means is that at the same time that I am speaking to you, you are also speaking to me. This feedback that we're giving each other is happening at the same time, simultaneously. And that is when you know that we are in the transactional model of communication. So in addition to the transactional model of communication that we've already discussed, there are other types of principles that guide our understanding with regard to communication. One of those principles is that communication is transactional. We've already kind of talked about that. Communication is a dynamic process that participants use to create their interaction with one another. Another is that communication can be either intentional or unintentional. We cannot not communicate. It is impossible not to communicate. Think about this. Even if you go off into a faraway land, maybe you go out camping in the mountains and disconnect all of your cell and internet service, you are still communicating a message to those of us who are left behind. So there's always an interpretation to be made, whether you intend to or not. Third, communication is irreversible. There is a common saying that you can't unsqueeze that tube of toothpaste. That's because it is impossible to unsend or unreceive a message once it's already out there. Fourth, communication is unrepeatable. And so that just basically means that the same words or behavior have different outcomes each time that they are spoken or performed. And then 5, Communication always has a content and a relational component to it. The content dimension is the message that I am trying to send. It's that thing that's explicitly discussed. But then there's also an underlying relational component to it as well. And this is basically explaining how you feel about that person in each communicative interaction. You're defining the relationship in that communicative interaction. So let's say you and I are having a conversation over Zoom, and I'm telling you that you need to complete your project or assignment by Friday. The content of this interaction is I'm telling you to complete an assignment, but there's a relational component about that too. We are communicating our teacher-student relationship in that sense. We also have communication misconceptions that are widely rampant out there, especially to people who didn't major or study communication. One of those misconceptions is that not all communication seeks understanding. So some people intentionally manipulate. We have social rituals that we go through that we are not really trying to understand the other person, or we might be trying to influence another individual as well. Another misconception is that more communication is not always better. Sometimes it's best to take a step back so that you can give each other space to breathe and process. Sometimes excessive communication can be unproductive and may not be the best option. Maybe you've all had some experiences like that. Third, communication cannot always solve all problems. As much as I would love for that to be the case, that isn't. Sometimes we just have disagreements that we can't get over, and it's better to agree to disagree. We might not always come to a resolution to each issue. And finally, effective communication is not something that comes naturally to people. It is something to be learned, studied, practiced over and over so that you can get better and better. So what makes communication interpersonal? Some people take a more quantitative approach to this, but we're going to be more qualitative about our meaning of interpersonal communication. So some people define interpersonal communication quantitatively as in a dyad. That means two people. If two people are interacting, that would be interpersonal communication. But that's not really where we're going to go with this. Instead, we're going to take a more qualitative approach to the definition of interpersonal communication. So a qualitative approach to defining interpersonal communication is when there is a relational quality where the individuals interacting treat each other as individuals. There are 4 different characteristics of interpersonal communication. One is uniqueness. So each relationship that we engage in has its own language, its own customs, its own rituals. Something that might work between you and your sibling might not work between you and your coworker, both of which are interpersonal relationships, but they're both unique in the things that you both consider acceptable and unacceptable. Another characteristic of interpersonal communication is interdependence. So that means that we rely on each other in order to achieve our goals. The third characteristic of interpersonal communication is self-disclosure. So how much about yourself are you revealing to the other person? If there's no self-disclosure at all, it's probably not interpersonal communication. And then finally, the 4th characteristic of interpersonal communication is there are intrinsic rewards, which basically means that there's something that you enjoy about being with this person or being in this relationship. Now, interpersonal communication is unique because it's rare and it takes a lot of energy and work to make an interaction highly interpersonal. So the difference between these two is impersonal basically is like you're just interacting with somebody out in your daily life. That would be kind of an impersonal type of communication. So calling to schedule an appointment with your doctor, ordering a pizza, getting coffee, those might be one-on-one interactions, but they're pretty impersonal. They're not meeting those characteristics that we already discussed. Whereas something that's highly interpersonal, these might be things like asking for forgiveness, a marriage proposal. These are much more deeper, interpersonal, rich interactions. And that doesn't mean that richer is always better. Because interpersonal relationships require so much out of us in terms of energy and effort, we cherish them more, but we also need to balance that with more interpersonal types of interactions as well. We can't be so deep all the time. This is actually something that I struggle with. I always want to have deep conversations with people. Not everybody likes that. Your book says something great about interpersonal communication, and it's that interpersonal communication is like rich food. Too much of it can make you uncomfortable. So at this point, we want to ask ourselves, how do we get better at communicating? What are some principles of communication competence? Communication competence is defined as any communication that is both effective and appropriate. So with that said, the first principle of communication competence is that there is no single ideal or one-size-fits-all prescription for how to communicate well. Instead, that leads us to the second principle of communication competence, which is that communication is always situational, or competence is always situational. It depends on who you're interacting with, where you are, what the goals are, what the experiences are of the people who are interacting. And then finally, competence is something that can be learned. You're probably not going to have it all figured out right off the bat. Instead, you find different situations to put yourself in, and you learn different things about people, and you figure out how to communicate with them more effectively and more appropriately. And with that said, we have 6 different characteristics of competent communicators. So when you communicate competently with somebody, you have a wide set of skills that you would use in an interpersonal interaction. And this increases the likelihood that you would achieve your goals and your personal goals and your relational goals with that person. You also have to be really adaptable. Since communication competence is situational, you have to be able to adapt yourself to each different situation that comes up. Additionally, you have to be able to perform that skill well. Another characteristic that you want to be able to have as a competent communicator is to engage in empathy and perspective taking. The more we know about other people and their experiences and their backgrounds and where they come from and how they see the world, the better it is that we're going to be able to connect with them. Cognitive complexity is another characteristic of communication competence. And this basically means that we have a variety of ways that we can approach a situation or view the world. Our brains allow us to construct different reasons why people might be thinking, behaving in different ways. And then finally, the last characteristic is that good, competent communicators are really good at self-monitoring. And this means that they pay attention to how they are behaving and interacting in a situation, and they use those observations to evaluate how well they're doing and make adaptations as they go. So to wrap it up, we figured out why and how we communicate. We've got different needs that need to be met, and we do so through a process called the transactional communication model. We also went over some principles and misconceptions of communication. We discussed some differences between impersonal and interpersonal communication and how it's good to have kind of a balance of both. And then we also discussed some ways for you to be a more competent communicator.